Hello again, and welcome to my channel, Blue Raven Thinks. Today, I want to dive into something we use every single day, often without giving it much thought: language. It's something I've been quietly fascinated by for a long time. While I don't want to make this video about myself, I will say that speaking multiple languages, Romanian, English, and Italian, has given me a deeper sense of how language not only reflects culture, but also shapes it. Combine this with my big love for history, and you'll understand why I chose this topic. This video is not for the faint of heart. If you're not ready to have your point of view challenged, I suggest you click off right now. But if instead, you're brave enough to face the truth, then stay with me. Because after this video, I guarantee you will never see language the same way again. Let's dive in. They didn't take your freedom. They redefined it. They didn't ban your thoughts. They rewired the very language you use to think them. This is the silent invasion, not with guns or armies, but with soft words whispered through screens, legislation, and corporate memos. By the time you notice, it will already be too late. Language is not just a tool. It is not merely a means of communication, nor is it simply a reflection of thought. It is the lens through which you perceive reality itself. Change the words, and you change the way people see, feel, and act without them ever realizing it. History's greatest conquerors understood a fundamental truth. To control a people, you must first control their language. This was never more evident than in three of history's most dominant empires: Rome, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Each wielded language not merely as a tool of administration, but as a weapon of psychological conquest. The Romans didn't just conquer lands, they Latinized them. Military victory was only the beginning. After crushing resistance, Rome imposed Latin as the language of law, commerce, and elite discourse. Local tongues were tolerated among peasants, but to ascend in society, one had to think in Latin. Latin wasn't just a language, it was a worldview. Its structure embedded Roman logic, hierarchy, and values. The very grammar reinforced order, authority, and imperial destiny. The result? Gauls, Iberians, and North Africans didn't just serve Rome, they became Roman. By the time the Western Empire fell, its subjects couldn't imagine an identity outside of Romanitas. The lesson? Conquer the language, and the people will conquer themselves. The British Empire didn't just rule, it anglicized. From Calcutta to the Caribbean, English was the sword and the scepter. Colonial schools didn't just teach English, they erased native languages, punishing children for speaking Hindi, Gaelic, or Swahili. English carried more than words, it carried cultural DNA. Shakespeare, Locke, and the King James Bible weren't just literature. They were ideological indoctrination. To speak English fluently was to admire Britain. Even after independence, the chains remained. Post-colonial elites kept English, ensuring their nations remained psychologically tethered to London. Why do Indian courts still argue in English? Why does Nigeria's government operate in it? The British didn't just leave behind railways and parliaments. They left behind minds that still think in their tongue. The USSR didn't just control territory, it controlled meaning. The Bolsheviks didn't just seize power, they seized the dictionary. Words like freedom, democracy, and justice were stripped of their original meanings and repurposed as party slogans. Entire concepts vanished. Private property became bourgeois exploitation. Strikes became counter-revolutionary sabotage. God became the opium of the masses. Newspeak wasn't fiction, it was policy. Soviet linguists systematically purged decadent words, replacing them with ideologically pure terms. To even think dissenting thoughts, one had to misuse the official language. The result? Millions literally couldn't articulate opposition, because the party had stolen the words to do so. Rome, Britain, and the USSR all grasped the same terrifying truth. You can rebel against an army. You can overthrow a government. But if your mind has been colonized by another's language, you will never truly be free. Today, the battlefield isn't territory, it's vocabulary. Hate speech replaces heresy. Misinformation replaces blasphemy. Diversity, equity, and inclusion replace the divine right of kings. And today, the invasion is subtler, more insidious. The occupation is invisible, masked by the soothing hum of progress, the gentle pressure of social approval, the quiet threat of cancellation. You are not being forced to speak a foreign tongue. You are being trained to think in one. This isn't the slow march of soldiers at the border. This is the reprogramming of your mind. One word, one phrase, one redefinition at a time. And it's happening right now, while you scroll, while you nod along, while you tell yourself, it's just words. Words do not merely describe reality, they construct it. The right phrase can turn horror into bureaucracy, atrocity into policy, and oppression into progress. This is the dark alchemy of the euphemism treadmill. The more brutal the act, the more sterile the language used to justify it. Collateral damage doesn't evoke images of limbs torn apart by shrapnel. It suggests an unfortunate but inevitable byproduct, like paperwork errors in an otherwise well-run office. Kinetic military action doesn't sound like missiles flattening homes. It sounds like a precise technical maneuver, something carried out by professionals in clean uniforms. Targeted deterrence doesn't force you to picture a father obliterated in front of his children. It implies a necessary measure, like trimming a hedge for better growth. The effect? The reality is laundered before it even reaches your conscience. Enhanced interrogation doesn't conjure the sounds of a man sobbing as his fingernails are ripped out. It sounds like a sophisticated, almost medical process, something done under bright lights by experts in lab coats. Stress positions doesn't make you imagine a human being forced into agonizing contortions for hours. It sounds like a mild discomfort, like sitting too long in economy class. Rendition doesn't bring to mind hooded prisoners being shipped to black sites. It sounds like an administrative transfer, like being moved to a different department, at work. The trick? The more clinical the term, the less human the suffering. Reproductive justice doesn't make you question whether an unborn child has rights. It frames abortion as a moral imperative, like feeding the hungry. Equity doesn't force you to grapple with unequal outcomes. It implies a noble correction, like balancing scales that were unfairly tipped. Harm reduction doesn't make you ask why addiction is skyrocketing. It suggests a compassionate compromise, like handing out clean needles instead of solving the crisis. The sleight of hand? The language preempts dissent by making opposition seem cruel, not principled. Content moderation doesn't sound like banning ideas. It sounds like removing toxins, like filtering impurities from water. Deplatforming doesn't evoke the silencing of dissent. It suggests removing a hazard, like taking a drunk driver off the road. Community guidelines doesn't make you think of ideological enforcement. It sounds like polite rules, like asking guests to remove their shoes. The genius? The language frames control as care, making resistance seem irrational. Every oppressive regime in history has mastered one crucial weapon. Not tanks, not guns, but words. The right euphemism can turn genocide into policy, starvation into strategy, and tyranny into necessity. This is not accidental. It is the oldest trick in the Book of Control. The Third Reich didn't just commit mass murder, they sanitized it with language. Final solution. Endlösung. Not extermination, just a bureaucratic resolution to a problem. Resettlement to the east. Not cattle cars to Auschwitz, but a relocation program. Special treatment, Sonderbehandlung. Not gassing, just an alternative process. By stripping words of their horror, they made participation possible for ordinary people. A clerk filing paperwork for evacuations could sleep at night far easier than one signing death warrants. Stalin's regime turned language into a hall of mirrors. Agricultural reorganization, not confiscating grain to starve millions, but modernizing farming. Enemies of the people, not innocent victims, but vermin requiring disposal. Re-education, not gulags, just schools for ideological correction. When reality is redefined, resistance becomes impossible. If the party says famine is progress, then opposing it is sabotage. Today's authoritarianism wears a softer mask, but the game is the same: public safety. Not mass surveillance, just keeping you secure. Misinformation. Not censorship, just filtering harmful content. Equity. Not discrimination, just fairness in new packaging. The language is designed to shame dissent. Question equity, you must oppose fairness. Doubt public safety, you must want chaos. This isn't just lying, it's systematic reality distortion. The process follows 3 stages. Routine. The new term is introduced as benign, it's just a word. Reasonableness. It becomes normalized, everyone uses it now. Righteousness. Opposing it is made immoral. Only a bigot would object. By the time people realize what's happening, the language has already reshaped their thinking. The moment you reject the euphemism, you break the spell. George Orwell saw it coming. In 1984, he wrote, "Don't you see that the whole aim of Newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible, because there will be no words in which to express it." Orwell imagined a boot stamping on a human face forever. He didn't foresee the velvet glove. Today, the euphemism treadmill spins faster than ever. Defund the police becomes reimagining public safety. Censorship becomes content moderation. Totalitarianism becomes equity and inclusion. Each shift in language is a shift in thought. Each new term is a step toward compliance. And you're already running on the treadmill, adjusting your speech, policing your own words, before they even have to. Words are far more than simple vehicles for communication. They are the architects of our world. They carve out categories that divide, classify, and assign value. These categories, once established, become the foundation for morality. The distinction between right and wrong, acceptable and unacceptable. Morality, in turn, is the tool that holds power, shaping actions and guiding decisions. It's not merely the content of words that holds weight, but the way they are used to create and enforce these categories. Whoever controls the labels controls the narrative, and whoever controls the narrative holds the power over the people. This principle was understood and expertly manipulated by history's darkest regimes. In Nazi Germany, the systemic murder of Jews was not referred to as genocide, not even as a mass slaughter. It was sanitized with the word cleansing. This euphemism distanced the reality of murder, framing it as a necessary purification, and by doing so, it made the act more palatable to the masses. In Soviet Russia, those who opposed the regime, those who dared to speak out against the oppressive state, were not imprisoned as political prisoners. No, they were rehabilitated, which implied that they were being corrected, that their thinking was simply wrong and needed to be fixed. In Mao's China, the executions of millions during the Cultural Revolution weren't simply executions. They were labeled as struggle sessions, as if these brutal killings were part of a necessary social process. The words were not used to describe the horror, they were used to make the horror acceptable, to remove the human element from the atrocities and cloak them in a veneer of moral righteousness. Fast forward to today, and while the language may be gentler, the consequences remain just as deadly. The label misinformation has become a catch-all term for anything that challenges the dominant narrative, erasing dissent by labeling it as falsehood. Hate speech is now used to silence any conversation that questions the prevailing orthodoxy, regardless of its validity. And the term conspiracy theorist has morphed into a weapon used against anyone who dares to question the official version of reality, anyone who remembers the lies of the past. These labels are not just words. They are powerful tools of control, weapons that, if you fail to recognize them, will disarm you before you even know what's happening. We now live in a world where the very concept of language has been warped into a paradox. Words, which have always been tools for communication, are now considered violent. Unless, of course, they are the words prescribed by the powers that be. Meaning, once a fixed and defined concept, has become subjective. Unless it's the meaning dictated by the dominant authority, This contradiction is not some accidental flaw in the system. It is, in fact, the very engine that powers it. The chaos you see around you, the confusion that permeates every conversation, is intentional. It is the system at work, bending and shaping your perception of reality. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein once said, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." He understood that language is not just a tool for expressing thoughts. It defines the boundaries of what we can think, what we can know, and ultimately, what we can believe. When you shrink the language, you shrink the mind itself. You replace clarity with slogans and catchphrases, and in doing so, you kill nuance. You kill the ability to think critically, to question, to discern. In its place, you are left with obedience. Obedience to a narrative that has been crafted for you, a narrative that erases dissent, that silences free thought in the name of inclusivity, safety, and progress. You have been conditioned deliberately and methodically to fear speaking your mind because words are now considered harmful, to doubt the meaning of your thoughts because truth is no longer objective, but subjective and fluid. You have learned to accept doublespeak, to accept that resistance is bigotry, that questioning the status quo is inherently evil. The greatest trick, however, is that you've learned to do this to yourself. You no longer need the authorities to keep you silent. You've internalized their message, their rules, and now you police your own thoughts and words, all on your own. The transformation of political correctness from a simple attempt at courtesy into a full-fledged societal law has been insidious, creeping in over time until it has suffocated the very notion of free speech. What began as a call for respect and understanding has become a rigid authoritarian structure that demands conformity, not only in behavior, but in thought. Once, freedom of speech meant the ability to say what you believe, to express yourself freely, to question authority, and to voice your dissent. But now, it has become a hollow shell of its former self. Today, freedom of speech is no longer about your right to express your beliefs. It's about saying only what is allowed by the powers that control the narrative. It's about saying only what will not be met with punishment, social or professional. The punishment is rarely explicit, often unspoken, but you feel it. The consequences of stepping out of line are real, even if they are not always immediate. Take the case of James Damore, the Google engineer who was fired for daring to question the company's diversity policies. His crime? He used the wrong words that didn't fit within the prescribed narrative of corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion. J.K. Rowling, the beloved author of Harry Potter, was publicly vilified and labelled a TERF, trans-exclusionary radical feminist, for simply defending biological reality, for stating that sex is not the same as gender. And Jordan Peterson, a clinical psychologist and professor, has been smeared as dangerous for refusing to submit to compelled speech laws, for standing firm in his belief that individuals should have the right to speak freely, without government or corporate imposition. The freedom to speak one's mind, to challenge the status quo, to push boundaries, has been replaced with the freedom to conform, the freedom to say only what is allowed, and the unspoken threat of punishment looms over every word you utter. You may be allowed to speak, but you must choose your words carefully, because the cost of speaking out, of stepping outside the approved narrative, is increasingly high. Truth does not arrive in polished phrases sanitized for your comfort. It does not come wrapped in the velvet gloves of bureaucratic jargon or the hollow platitudes of political correctness. Truth comes sharp. It comes unyielding. It comes dangerous. Martin Luther King Jr. did not stand before the Lincoln Memorial and speak of racial discomfort, as if racism were a mild headache to be soothed with aspirin. He called it what it was: injustice. He spoke of fire hoses, police dogs, and the brutal reality of segregation, not because he wanted to offend, but because truth cannot be told any other way. Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn did not write a gentle memoir about Soviet realignment camps. as if the Gulag were a wellness retreat gone slightly awry. He titled his work The Gulag Archipelago, a deliberate, unflinching indictment of a machinery of suffering. He forced the world to see the barbed wire, the frozen corpses, the systematic crushing of human souls. They spoke plainly, and that is why they were feared. Because raw truth does not negotiate, it does not compromise, it does not apologize for its existence. Today, those who speak truth face a sophisticated system of suppression, disguised as benevolence, deplatformed, framed as regulated, as if dissent were a toxic spill needing containment, silenced, branded as protected, as if the public were children who must be shielded from bad thoughts, erased, dismissed as cancelled, as if inconvenient voices were merely trends that faded. The pattern is unmistakable. The more dangerous the truth, the softer the language used to suppress it. Because when you say war crimes instead of collateral damage, torture instead of enhanced interrogation, censorship instead of community guidelines, you short-circuit the euphemism machine. You force people to confront reality without the anesthetic of manipulated language. And that is why the architects of soft tyranny work so desperately to keep truth wrapped in layers of meaningless jargon. Because once the packaging is torn away, the lies are exposed. Every atrocity begins with words. Words shape perceptions, guide actions, and dictate societal norms. The most brutal and horrific events in human history did not start with weapons, but with language, the subtle and insidious manipulation of it. The Rwandan genocide, a moment of unfathomable violence, didn't begin with machetes or bloodshed. It began with a simple yet deadly word: cockroaches. The Tutsi people were labeled as vermin, unworthy of life, undeserving of human dignity. The word, seemingly harmless in its simplicity, carried with it an ideology of eradication. Once the dehumanization took root in language, the physical violence was only a matter of time. The words made it possible to see the Tutsis as less than human, as pests to be exterminated. The same pattern was repeated during the Holocaust. The Nazi regime didn't merely kill Jews, they redefined them. The word vermin became a justification for mass murder. By labeling Jews as pests, as disease-carrying creatures, the Holocaust was framed as a cleansing, a necessary and justified act. Similarly, in Stalin's Soviet Union, the purges of the kulaks, the rural landowners who were deemed enemies of the state, were rationalized by a language of extermination. To eliminate the kulaks wasn't to kill human beings, it was to remove a threat, to rid the state of an undesirable class. It was a linguistic frame that allowed monstrous acts to be committed without the need for moral reckoning. Today, the dehumanization is quieter, more sophisticated, more insidious, but just as dangerous. The same mechanism is at play, now disguised with cleaner, more palatable language. The unvaccinated, once simply a medical category, have been branded as plague rats, cast out as dirty and dangerous, as though they were carriers of something that must be eradicated. The word itself makes it easier to justify the silencing of dissent, the marginalization of the other. Dissidents who stand against the prevailing narrative are not merely opposing views. They are labeled domestic terrorists. The word repositions them from citizens with a voice to enemies of the state, threats to societal order. And now, the most sacred institution in a democracy, parents, have become extremists for daring to question what is taught in their children's schools. Words have become weapons. They dehumanize, they vilify, they marginalize. And once dehumanization takes root, it is only a short leap to extermination, whether it be physical, political, or cultural. Dictators once relied on newspapers to spread their messages of control. They used radio broadcasts to craft the narrative, to shape public perception, to build the foundations of their power. But the methods have evolved. Today's authoritarians are far more subtle, far more integrated into the very fabric of daily life. They no longer need to broadcast their propaganda through controlled state media. They use the very platforms you interact with every day. Google, for example, does not censor information. It applies algorithmic fairness. This phrase hides the reality of information manipulation behind a veneer of objectivity and neutrality. Twitter does not ban users. It engages in private platform moderation. They can remove you from the conversation, discredit your voice, without ever admitting they've silenced you. And the media, they don't spread lies. They present fact-checked narratives, offering a version of reality carefully curated to fit the agenda. The result is the same as it was with the old tools of propaganda. History is being rewritten. But instead of being rewritten with fire and blood, it is rewritten with euphemisms and sanitized language. Words like freedom and democracy are hollowed out, stripped of their true meaning, and replaced with whatever fits the needs of those in power. The very nature of truth is contorted, distorted, and packaged into something unrecognizable. History, once told through raw accounts of human suffering and triumph, is now filtered through the lens of corporate interests and political ideologies. The reality we live in is no longer shaped by what happens. It is shaped by how the narrative is told and who controls the telling. It is often said that words are powerful because they shape our understanding of the world. But what happens when words lose their meaning? What happens when words, once imbued with clarity and purpose, become diluted, distorted, and redefined? The power of language lies in its ability to convey truths, to sharpen our thinking and guide our actions. But in today's world, even our most fundamental concepts have been hijacked by language that no longer reflects their true essence. Take meritocracy. Once a beacon of fairness and opportunity, the term has been hijacked and transformed into white supremacy. Where merit used to mean hard work, talent, and achievement, now it is accused of perpetuating inequality, as if competence itself were a tool of oppression. Free speech, the cornerstone of democratic societies, is now dismissed as hate speech when it challenges the prevailing narrative. What was once a fundamental right is now seen as a threat, an invitation to division and violence. Science itself has become a weapon, not in the pursuit of truth, but in the enforcement of conformity. And let us not forget the most insidious transformation of all. What was once forbidden science has now simply become the science that is labeled dangerous, silenced by those who seek to control knowledge and suppress inquiry. The words still exist. They are here, floating around us, but they no longer hold the meaning they once did. The truth is obscured, hidden beneath layers of euphemism and manipulation. We are left with language that serves the agendas of the few, rather than the needs of the many. What is at stake here is not merely vocabulary, it's perception itself. It is the ability to recognize reality, to name the problems that face us, to identify the forces that threaten our freedom. If you cannot name the lie, you cannot fight it. If you cannot describe the trap, you are already caught in it. This is the true power of language manipulation. It doesn't just control the way you speak, it controls the way you think. It controls your ability to see the world as it truly is. When your language is shaped by others, your perception of reality becomes warped. You no longer see the world as it is. You see it as they want you to see it. Look closely. Watch how the new language takes hold. Watch how words, once free and full of meaning, are gradually replaced by terms that carry a different agenda. See how the narrative shifts. A word enters circulation, first whispered by a few, then echoed by the media, by politicians, by influencers. It's repeated, amplified, and suddenly the old word is offensive, outdated, irrelevant. The new word becomes law, and with it, a new reality is forged. For too long, we've allowed others to dictate the language we use, to shape the words we speak. We've become passive recipients of language, repeating the phrases that are given to us, adopting the terms that have been handed down, without ever questioning their meaning or their origin. But you still have your voice. You still have your words. if you dare to reclaim them. It starts with speaking plainly. It starts with saying what you mean, not what someone else wants you to say. Strip away the euphemisms, the jargon, the sanitized language. Speak the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. Think clearly. Do not allow others to cloud your mind with language that twists your thoughts and distorts your reality. Resist the urge to conform, to fit in, to be silenced by the new lexicon that seeks to control you, because language isn't just how we communicate. It's how we survive. It's how we resist. It's how we reclaim our world. If this video made you think differently, even for a moment, consider subscribing to Blue Raven Thinks. Like the video if it resonated with you, and share it with someone who still believes words are just words. The more we understand the tools being used against our perception, the more power we have to reclaim it. Until next time, stay curious, stay awake, and above all, don't let them rewrite your reality.